Welcome everybody to our newest episode of Peugeot. For those who don't know me yet, my name is Ruben Gertschikow. I'm the Leckert Vice President of the European Union of Jewish Students, currently living and working in Berlin. And it's my pleasure to introduce you our guest speaker for today, Professor Neumann. You already read what he has done, but I will give you a short summary of his biography. Moment. He is a professor for security studies at King's College in London. He's also the founding director of the International Center for the Study of Radicalization, also at the King's College. In 2017, he served as a special envoy for the fight against radicalization by the OSCE. And recently he published his book, Bluster, Trump's War on Terror. And it's really my pleasure to have you here, Peter. And the stage is yours.
Thank you, Ruben. It's a great honor and pleasure to be with you today. And I'm going to talk about the various different theories and myths that people have articulated over the past 3 months in relation to coronavirus, and trying to make sense of them, and also trying to explain why they matter and why they are important and what to do about them. What I'm going to argue is that even though the people and the theories that are being articulated are diverse, there are certain ideas that are underlying all of them. And even though it is not principally or primarily about Jews, there is still content that can be seen as anti-Semitic. And there's reasons why these theories and ideas are important and dangerous. And what I want to do is to focus on the situation in Germany on the one hand and the United States on the other hand. I want to give you an overview. I want to point out some of the similarities between the different movements in different countries, but also some of the differences, focusing on the potential for radicalization, but also, and in particular, on the role of anti-Semitism. So to start with, after the lockdowns that came in mid-March, maybe about 4 weeks later, we witnessed demonstrations in a lot of Western European countries and also in North America. Thousands of people went onto the streets, basically saying this was wrong, this shouldn't happen, and we should get over it. And this was a new phenomenon. A lot of people turned up at these demonstrations that hadn't been seen before. It was a diverse movement. It was not easy necessarily in all of the countries to necessarily associate them with an established political agenda. And that's true. So if, for example, you looked at Germany, if you looked at the demonstrations in Germany, you saw at least 4 different types of people. The first group of people that I identified, I would classify as esoterics. They were people who were concerned about so-called chemtrails. They were against vaccinations, many of them not necessarily explicitly political. A second group I would describe as sovereign citizens. In Germany, that's called Reichsbürger. They were doubting the legitimacy of the entire state, of the government. They were against these measures because they thought that it overstepped the authority of legitimate authority. A third group I would consider to be the traditional far right. It's full spectrum. You had the Alternative for Germany, the political party trying to take advantage of this movement, especially in the east of Germany. But you also had Holocaust deniers, you had traditional neo-Nazi groups. All of these people turned up at these demonstrations trying to win people over for their particular agenda. And then the fourth group, you had concerned citizens who hadn't been necessarily politically active, but who were genuinely concerned about what was happening and came to these demonstrations. It's a very mixed group of people, a group of people that you couldn't necessarily summarize in one particular position. So if you look at America, it was slightly different. And the difference, I think, is because in America, this issue of COVID-19, pretty much from the very beginning, was a partisan issue. In Germany, basically all mainstream parties everyone, 85% of the population, according to most opinion polls, was supporting the government's stance. There wasn't a partisan divide on this issue. Whereas in America, from the very beginning, there was a partisan divide. Democrats and centrists supported the lockdown, whereas Trump, the president of the United States, and his supporters were very much against it. And so the people who turned up at these demonstrations in the United States were almost exclusively Trump supporters. But within that segment of Trump supporters, you had two groups that were particularly strong. And one group is what we have come to call the QAnon supporters. They are supporters of conspiracy theory, which sounds crazy and sounds wild, but has become quite popular amongst Trump supporters of the past 2.5 years. And that conspiracy theory says that basically worldwide, there is a cabal of Satanist, pedophile people, including Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and the entire American political establishment that are trying to cover up for their wrongdoings, and that they would continue to do so if Donald Trump hadn't come to power. And Donald Trump is going to root them out, but he's prevented in doing that by the deep state. And the people who support this completely unfounded and evidence-free theory have become quite strong within the support base of Donald Trump, and they were quite prominent in these demonstrations that have happened over the past 2 months. Another group that has been quite strong are supporters of the so-called, and that's a really new term, of the so-called Boogaloo movement, something that really turned up at the end of last year that has existed in various iterations for a much longer time. They are essentially supporters of militias. They are gun rights advocates. They are believing that the enemy is the government, that they want to take the guns away, and that this is basically part of the strategy for doing so. And so these quite extreme movements, both the QAnon and the Boogaloo supporters, have been quite prominent in the American demonstrations, which have been right-wing, which have been Trump supporting. But if you look at the detail of it, there have also been nuanced differences among the various groups. So that's the basic situation in Germany and in America. So now let me move on to the next question, which is, what did these movements share? What do they have in common? As I explained, these are quite different people, Germany, America, within Germany, but there are certain things they all have in common. And I would point out 3 things in particular. The first is a deep distrust, and I would say a complete rejection of what these people would call the official narrative. What you hear from government, what you see in the media, what most of us on this Facebook chat today would accept as the facts. They completely reject that. They would reject that the virus has necessarily come from China. They would reject that the spread of the virus was unintended. They would reject that COVID-19 is even real, that it is worse than the flu, or that any of the measures that have been implemented to counter it were in any way necessary. They completely reject the official narrative, what they call the official narrative, and anyone who articulates it, anyone who articulates any component of that official narrative is immediately classified as part of the conspiracy. The second part, or the second element that they all share, is that almost all of them get their information from what I would call non-recognized authorities. They don't believe, they completely reject everything that comes through what they call mainstream media or traditional programs that are composed by journalists, government announcements. All of that is suspicious. A complete loony expert on Facebook who has 50 followers on Twitter is more authoritative and is more authentic in their view than even the most recognized expert. So almost all of them get their information from these sources, from YouTube, from Facebook, from message boards on the internet. And the third element that they have in common is that they all believe that what has happened over the past 3 months is not an accident. It is, in fact, a plot. It is a plot by the global elites to take over, to take away people's rights and freedoms, to control them, and to establish some form of world government. So that's really important because that's essentially the conspiracy. So what's happened over the past 3 months is not something that is just a terrible tragedy that has inflicted the world, that we have all struggled with in different ways. It is in fact a plan that is playing out. And all good conspiracy theories or conspiracy myths are based to some extent on facts. And this is interesting because this is a good example, in fact, of how conspiracy theories or conspiracy myths work. They are based on facts, but they are taking those facts and they are turning and twisting these facts into something that creates an entirely different reality, which is no longer true. So to give you this example, it is true that over the past 3 months in most Western democracies, there has been a suspension of liberties that has been unprecedented. It is true that Bill Gates is a very rich man who wants people to get vaccinated. This is true. This is what he has dedicated his life to in the last 20 years with his wife. And it is also true, and this is something that perhaps not everyone has heard about, that there is an NGO called ID 2020 that wants to provide ID to people in poor countries because it helps them get social services, it helps them establish their identity, it stops people from killing them, essentially, in an arbitrary fashion. Those are all true facts, right? Bill Gates is a rich person, civil rights to some extent have been suspended, and there's an organization, ID 2020, all true facts. But what happens now with the conspiracy is that people take these facts and they connect them. They connect them and twist them in a completely different way so that an entirely different reality emerges. So what they are saying is that Bill Gates has been supporting ID 2020, which is true. And he has done that in order to forcefully vaccinate everyone in order to become even richer. And he's doing that in order to enable global governments to take over control and to establish a world government. And now the way that these facts are being connected creates a reality that is a complete fantasy. Whilst for the individual facts, there's evidence, for the connection between these facts, there's no evidence. And that creates what I would call the conspiracy theory. And I call it theory. A lot of people don't like it. They say you should call it conspiracy myth. I call it theory because it is precisely about the connection between these facts. It creates a theory about how these facts are being connected. And obviously, the theory is completely false. But what makes it attractive and what makes it resonate with people is that some of it, the individual facts, can to some extent be true. And if you go to a conspiracy theorist and you tell them that this is completely nonsense, they will send you a link to a website where it says Bill Gates wants to vaccinate people, which is true. And they will send you a link to a website where it says ID 2020 wants to ID people. And they will send you links to all sorts of speeches by Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron, where they've said, well, we want the world to work more closely together. And they say, add it up, connect the dots, and ask yourself who benefits, cui bono, you know? And that creates the conspiracy. Every good conspiracy theory is built on individual facts that are connected in a way that create a myth or a lie or something for which there's no evidence. What is the link to anti-Semitism? And for that, you have to take a step back a little bit, because obviously this theory is not principally about Jews. Bill Gates is not a Jew as far as I know. And anti-Semitism is, of course, a form of racism. But a lot of Jewish organizations, as you well know, would say that whilst anti-Semitism is a form of racism, it is also different from a lot of other forms of racism, and it deserves to be treated in a slightly different way. So what's the difference? One of the key differences between racism as a whole and anti-Semitism is that most racisms, let's say racism against Black people or racism against Sinti and Roma, most of the narratives about these groups that are being targeted are that these groups are weak, they are lazy, that they are inferior, that they are less intelligent, less cultured, less sophisticated. That's typically what racism involves. You're picking a group and you're saying they are inferior to us, whoever the us is. Now with Jews, the narrative is slightly different. Contrary to all the other racism, the narrative about Jews is the exact opposite. It's not that they are inferior, that they are weak or lazy. The classic narrative about Jews in anti-Semitism is that Jews are powerful, that they are scheming, that they are secret puppet masters that control the world because they have the money, they are behind the politicians, they control the media. And the modern manifestation of all of these myths, of this anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, is George Soros. That's why he's so popular with anti-Semites, because he embodies all of that. He's a very rich man. He's very much connected to politicians, and he's funding all of these organizations that are supposedly manipulating you. That's the essence of anti-Semitism. And that explains why there's such an intrinsic relationship between conspiracy theories and anti-Semitism. Not because all conspiracy theories are necessarily about Jews, but because all conspiracy theories are about dark forces that are secretly controlling the world. And ultimately, when you start doing your research on YouTube and you're trying to find out who are these dark forces that are secretly controlling the world, you will end up eventually with the Jews. So there is an intrinsic relationship, and there's a lot of conspiracy theories that don't necessarily start with the Jews, but that end up with the Jews. And a great example of that is someone both you, Ruben, and I know, not personally, but by association, is a guy called Attila Hildmann, who's become very famous in Germany over the past few weeks. He used to be a TV chef before, didn't necessarily do a lot of political statements. He's become radicalized. And in the beginning, he wasn't necessarily talking about Jews a lot. But you can follow him on Telegram and you can see how over the past 4 or 5 weeks, he's basically gone through every possible conspiracy theory, trying to explain what's happening. And of course, over the last week, he's ended up with the Jews. He says this is a Jewish conspiracy because they are ruling the world. They are the ones behind Merkel, behind Gates and so on, and they want to take over. So that's a great example of how a conspiracy theory that didn't necessarily start with the Jews ended up with the Jews, just simply because, sadly, I have to say, over the past 2,000 years, the most established theory of who controls the world, sadly, that is something that is seems to still be part of our cultural DNA, is the anti-Semitic trope. And that's why this link between conspiracy theories and anti-Semitism is so intrinsic. So that's what all of these people have in common. These, the fact that they reject recognized authorities, that they're getting their information from the internet, and that they have an idea of who plots what. So let me briefly, towards the end, come to the differences between these movements. I've spoken a lot about what they have in common, but there are also reasons for them differing. And there are two in particular. The first, I would say, is political context. Now, in Germany, the far right, the Alternative for Germany, and even more far right actors have tried to capitalize on this movement. They've tried to make it part of its own. They've infiltrated these demonstrations, and they've largely failed in doing so. Why have they failed? They failed partly because it was clearly opportunistic, people didn't like it, people noticed it. They failed partly because the narrative that the AfD was trying to spread, that this was all about immigration and borders and asylum seekers, it just didn't resonate with people. It didn't make sense in the current context. And they also failed because the lockdown has come more or less to an end, because restrictions in all German states are being eased, borders are being reopened, the whole movement has lost momentum. So the relatively good way in which the German government has dealt with this crisis has actually contributed to exposing the emptiness of the theories of the conspiracists behind. And that's why actually overall, the people who wanted to exploit this movement have failed to become part of the mainstream. The movement has never really caught fire with the majority of the population. No one in the mainstream picked up on it, and the arguments didn't resonate. The justification for the whole movement fell away. And so that's why I think these demonstrations have declined and the mainstream hasn't picked up on it. And that was different in America, where this movement is part of the partisan divide. The president of the United States, Donald Trump, has more or less endorsed it, has come out in support of these people, where we have an election year, where this pandemic is part of larger conspiracies like QAnon, like Boogaloo. The pandemic is only one small part of something that builds a whole narrative. And where in fact, some of that narrative has been articulated not only by the people who turn up at these demonstrations, but as I said, by the President of the United States, by members of Congress, by candidates for Congress, but even the National Security Advisor. So in America, this idea that this is a plot has already become part of the mainstream. And I think it will become an important part of the election year contest this year, which is going to be very nasty. So that's one difference between Germany and the United States. And the second difference is guns. In contrast to Germany, there are 300 million privately held guns in circulation in the United States. The Boogaloo movement that I mentioned before is effectively a gun rights movement, which is increasingly assertive and which occupied the governor's mansion in Michigan briefly. They believe that civil war is inevitable, that the country is doomed, and that the best way forward, the only way forward, is to accelerate the path towards the final confrontation, a great cathartic confrontation, which people stand up against the government and afterwards start from scratch. They're not just okay with violence, they are embracing violence, and everything they put out is glorifying violence. That is not the case in Germany. And so I'm much more concerned, to be honest, in summary, that the consequences of this are going to be more dramatic than what we've already seen, and that this is going to play out, particularly in the United States and America, over this election year. So to conclude, we have a diverse movement. We have a movement that has been digitally enabled, which is characterized by a deep distrust of recognized sources of authority, that believes that what we've seen over the past 2 or 3 months is a plot to establish one world government. It's based on a conspiracy myth. And I do think that it has a dangerous component. It has a dangerous ideological component in both countries because it leads people to anti-Semitism. It doesn't necessarily start with it, but it leads people to anti-Semitism. And I think in particular in America, there is a potential for this to become even more nasty and for people who are already armed to their teeth to see this as part of a movement that gets them into violence. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot. It was really interesting. It would be great because I'm not sure how many people do they know the QAnon, the QAnon movement. Mm-hmm. So maybe you can explain a little bit further who is QAnon and what they are doing and how they are doing and why is it dangerous also in America and also in Europe or especially in Germany.
Sure. So the QAnon movement is something that appeared in 2017 on various message boards like 4chan and 8chan. And it essentially was someone who claimed to be an insider, who claimed to be someone who was part of the government and a supporter of Trump. And over a longer period of time, in various messages, that person, some people think it's several persons, articulated the conspiracy. And the conspiracy is that essentially the world is run by a cabal of Satanist pedophiles. And everyone is part of it. Republicans, Democrats, Hillary Clinton certainly was a part of it. Barack Obama was a part of it. A lot of people who work in government are parts of it. And they're trying to cover up their bad deeds. And they would have continued doing that if Donald Trump hadn't come to power. Donald Trump has come to power to stop this, to put an end to this. And the reason why he's not more successful with his projects is because the deep state, the people who are part of the conspiracy, are trying to prevent him from doing what he wants to do. And it's a very clever theory. It's very wild and it's completely evidence-free, but it's very clever because it explains to supporters of Trump why their president is not doing what he promised to do in the 2016 election campaign. So in 2016, he promised, I will build a wall with Mexico and Mexico will pay for it. Why is that not happening? He's the president now, right? And the reason it's not happening is because he's surrounded by enemies. There's a huge conspiracy against him. All the people who are working for him are really working against him. So the essence of QAnon is that Donald Trump is the great disruptor. He's uncovering a great conspiracy, an evil conspiracy. He's trying to stop it. He's the good guy, but everyone around him is trying to prevent him. That's the idea of QAnon. And there are always messages coming on different message boards, basically saying there's going to be arrests soon. People are going to be indicted. People are going to be locked up. That doesn't happen because it's not true. But a lot of people are very much hooked to this. And you see members of the military, members of law enforcement, supporters of Trump running around with signs saying Q, that they are supporters of Q. No one knows who Q is. Some people even say it's a number of people, but it's something that has gained a lot of traction within the hardcore Trump supporting base.
We got a question from the audience to this exactly. Can you explain how conspiracy myths like QAnon, which originated in the US, find their audience in Europe?
Sure. Oh yeah, I didn't answer that.
Wait, sorry. Of interest being Germany, especially since many who believe in such myths aren't literate in English.
Well, I think you're right in the sense that language barriers are often something that prevents these conspiracies from spreading. And it's certainly true that this QAnon myth is more popular in Germany, for example, than it is in Italy. Why is that? Because I do think that there are more people in Germany that are capable of translating that into German than there are in Italy. And so there are people who have translated the ideas of the QAnon movement into German. There is a significant number of supporters who speak sufficient English to get the gist of it. And they are providing, and you can find on Facebook, ironically, you can find QAnon supporting sites in German as well as in English. And whenever a message comes out from the United States, there will immediately be German supporters who translate that into German. Because even for Germans, of course, number one, it's interesting what Donald Trump is doing, given how prominent he is and given that he's president of the United States. But secondly, and equally importantly, this conspiracy myth is not only about the United States. It is actually about a global conspiracy. It's a global cabal of people who control politics, control media, control our cultures. that are trying to cover up their crimes. So it goes beyond the United States of America. In that sense, it's in theory, in principle, interesting for everyone everywhere.
So I would like to know also, you talked a little bit about all these image boards, 4chan, 8chan, and mostly, like most people who are active there are affiliated to right-wing policies. Why do you think are conspiracy myths so popular for right-wing, for the right wing in general? And what are maybe consequences?
I think, I do think, well, it's an excellent question, and I would even I would say it's far from clear whether conspiracy myths are uniquely popular amongst the right wing. I think as someone who has studied Islamist extremism for many years, there's of course almost all extremist ideologies are built on conspiracies. Whether it's Islamists, whether it's far-right extremists, and even to some extent, even far-left extremism is built on a conspiracy theory. And and the reason is that basically in every extremist ideology, you're essentially looking for a scapegoat. You're looking for someone who basically is responsible for whatever you consider to be the wrongs and the bad things that your society has been inflicted with. You're looking for a scapegoat, and you're only getting that scapegoat because life is complicated and politics is complicated, because there's typically not one person or one group of people responsible for every bad thing in the world. What conspiracy myths do, they make it easy for you because they are saying exactly that. They are saying that every bad thing in the world is connected to that one person or that one group of people. And that's why I think that all extremists are attracted to these conspiracy theories, because they make things easy. And secondly, and that's the most important thing, they give people a sense of control. They empower people. A lot of people who are not particularly interested in politics, they are sitting at home. The pandemic is happening. It's a crazy situation. No one knows exactly what is behind it. And a conspiracy theory gives you an answer and gives you a sense of control, and it gives you someone to blame, and it gives you an explanation. And many people feel that that is very comforting, that is something that they are longing for, an easy explanation that they understand, that allows them to make sense of the world. And I think that's what extremists are exploiting.
Then when, like in the last year, we saw different terrorist attacks, far-right terrorist attacks, for example, in Christchurch or in Halle on the synagogue during Yom Kippur. Both terrorists were active on different image boards. Can you explain what happened from being online, being active on 4chan, 8chan, to I would grab a gun and try to kill Muslims, Jews, or other minorities, or even the political enemy, for example, the left, in this sense?
So I think it's it's hard to generalize, but it's very clear that these message boards, whether it's 4chan, 8chan, or other message boards, that all of these attackers had been active on, that these message boards provided echo chambers in which these people got immersed in deeper and deeper. And they were places, virtual places, in which very extreme opinions were becoming normalized. And in a normal environment, if you hang out with your family, with your parents, and you say something that is very extreme, someone will tell you off and will tell you, this is not the right thing to say. You should think about it. You should shut up. This is completely wrong. Someone will start an argument with you. So if you're in a normal environment, you're hanging out with your friends, with your family, if you're at school or at university, and you're saying something extreme, you can expect some sort of pushback. However, if you go into these message boards and if you go into the specific groups within these message boards, it's the exact opposite. When you say something extreme, you get support, you get applause. And in fact, there's almost a competition between people who can be more outrageous, who can be more extreme. And the more outrageous you are, the more support and applause you get. So instead of moderating, people are egging each other on. And it's almost like a competition for who can be the most extreme. So relatively extreme ideas are getting normalized. And your whole incentive structure within your brain as to what is acceptable, what is socially acceptable, what is desirable, gets completely skewed. With the result that if you spend a lot of time within these message boards, if the people hanging out in these message boards become your friends, your acquaintances, your social contacts, if you start thinking of them as real people and people on whose approval you depend, then at some point you may conclude, I actually have to demonstrate to them that I'm the coolest guy in the room. I'm the coolest guy on the board. And I've always said in the media, and I think that's a really important point, that when you are a terrorist, when you commit a terrorist act, you don't want to do it for yourself. No terrorist does it for themselves. Every terrorist believes that there's an audience, that there are supporters who will applaud and support what they are doing. And in the case of New Zealand, in the case of Halle, in the case of Norway, in the case of the attacks on synagogues in the United States, all of these guys were expecting that once they carried out their attack, there would be people in these message forums who would cheer them on, who would see them as heroes, who would celebrate them. And that's the function of these message boards. They are providing the audience, the constituency for which you're doing this. And that's, I think, what makes them dangerous, yes.
Okay, so we got two another questions from the audience. The first question is, are the anti-corona protests uniting right and left-wing conspiracy demonstrators in equal measure in the US or in Germany, or do we see different mixes of demonstration in each country?
I think that's kind of what I was trying to get at in my short presentation, that in the United States, almost all of the demonstrators are people who you would normally locate on the right of the political spectrum. Whereas in Germany, it is in fact a mix. And that you've seen people from the unorthodox left uniting or making common cause with people on the far right. Even though I would say even in Germany, most of the people who are explicitly political are on the right end of the political spectrum rather than the left.
And the second question is, even if the demonstrations are fading somewhat in Germany, have they brought forth a new level of anti-Semitism that is likely to continue?
I think it's too early to tell. It's very clear. I mean, I followed this very closely. It's very clear that various people who are explicit anti-Semites have tried to use these demonstrations as a platform. They've gone to the demonstrations, Holocaust deniers have gone to these demonstrations, have talked to people, have tried to say, look, this is all connected, the Jews are behind this, etc., etc. What we've seen are attempts, whether it has worked and whether this has provided these people with more support and that support can be sustained, I don't think it's clear at this point whether this can be articulated at all. What I can say is that generally speaking, the radical right, like the Alternative for Germany supporters, for example, have not had the success that they would have expected. So at almost all of the demonstrations across Germany, but especially in the east of Germany, you had a sustained and systematic presence of AfD, trying to hijack these demonstrations for their own purposes and trying to convert the people who came to these demonstrations into supporters for their own party. And by and large, they have not succeeded. In fact, there have been a number of demonstrations where the second they became about AfD, people started staying home. And because people recognized that, and they said, we don't want this to be about a political party, we're genuinely upset about the lockdown, and we don't necessarily support your agenda. So whilst I'm always the first one to warn of the far right and the AfD, I don't think at this point it is clear that they have succeeded in capitalizing, exploiting this movement. We will have to wait and see. It may be, but so far, most of the indications that I have seen are that they have not really succeeded. They have, in fact, in many instances, failed to take advantage of that movement.
What I'm interested in also, how can we, for example, in Germany, a lot of stuff is happening on Telegram, for example, and also what we talked about, 8chan, 4chan, and it's getting less and less on like mainstream social media like Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter. How can we control, or how can be like a counter speech, or is it possible to do counter speech on platforms like 8chan, 4chan?
It's very difficult, and I would say that I'm talking now about sort of my experience and knowledge about de-radicalization, if you can use that term in that context. I mean, we're often talking about de-radicalization in the context of ISIS and Islamists, but it's effectively about persuading people, and I think that it's very hard to convince someone to abandon their views when they are fully involved in it. And that's why it's so difficult if you go into 4chan or 8chan and you're trying to argue against people. It's almost pointless. It's kind of almost counterproductive, because in psychology, they have a word for this. It's called reactance. If you confront someone who is very firm in their views with a countering position, it actually allows them to reaffirm and to re-articulate their own position, and they become even more firm and more convinced that what they are saying is correct. So I would be careful about that. What I do think, where I do think you can make a difference, is if people are at the beginning of getting interested in these theories, and if people are at the very end, in the sense that they're becoming disillusioned with it. So if in your circle of friends, if you encounter someone that you work with or that you go to university with, who starts talking about this suddenly and starts saying, oh, well, you should stop watching the mainstream media. I have these good sources, check out this link on YouTube. But you have the feeling that this person is not fully into it yet, but that person is exploring these ideas. I think that's an opportunity to talk to that person, and to talk to them not in a lecturing way, not to say to them, look, this is rubbish, you're ridiculous, these are lies, but to ask them questions and to say, well, if it is true that 9/11 was caused by the American government in order to go into Iraq and steal their oil, why didn't they make it seem that the attack was coming from Iraq, but instead made it seem like the attack was coming from Afghanistan, right? So you will see, once you start asking questions, probing questions to your friends in a sympathetic way, they will perhaps themselves recognize that many of these theories don't add up and that they are not a good explanation. And so if they are exploring, if they are not firmly settled in their views, if they're exploring these ideas, or if they are becoming disillusioned with them, then you have a chance. But if they are completely involved in their movements, they are feeling happy, they think they have the answer to everything, it's really difficult to convince someone of the opposite.
So what we're gonna do with all the people who are completely inside this inside their movements and they don't believe to, let's call it like mainstream media or to experts, what can we do about this?
Well, I would say it's wrong to think that there's necessarily a solution for that. I think that You cannot completely ban conspiracy theories. Many of them are not, I mean, they don't contain, they contain content that is false, but not necessarily something that encourages or incites violence or hatred, at least not directly, at least perhaps indirectly, but not directly. So you cannot ban everything. I would encourage, especially if you're working with platforms like YouTube, with Facebook, to be more responsible, to pay more attention to it, to point out disinformation to people. You know, maybe people don't believe it, but it makes them think again. And also to take warning signs seriously. If you have people amongst your friends, amongst your acquaintances, people you go to university with, people you work with, who are starting to talk like that, take it seriously and try to talk to them. And hopefully, by preventing more people to get into these theories, you can over time limit the appeal of these theories. And then there's, of course, a very important piece of advice that comes out of what I just talked about, which is that the mainstream of the political scene shouldn't give these conspiracy theories credibility. So the difference between America and Germany is that mainstream politicians in Germany have not basically taken on board these ideas. They have not mainstreamed them. They should stay where they are, which is on the fringe of the political spectrum. Once you give them credibility, once the President of the United States is articulating these theories, they become normalized. And then basically you're messing up the entire discourse in your country. So what you can do as a mainstream person is to pay attention to it, to speak to people who you think are at risk of adopting these ideas, but also to pay attention that you're not mainstreaming these ideas, that they are not having a place in parliament, or that they are having a place in proper political discourse.
So we have another 10 minutes. So if you have questions, just write a comment and we'll ask about this. Another thing, because you got criticized and I got criticized as well for publishing stuff which is happening in some of the Telegram. My question is, why should we don't stop publishing stuff which is happening in Telegram?
Well, I think you should be careful about it. I think it's important that whenever you publish something, and the same question, by the way, this is not the first time that I'm facing this. Throughout the whole ISIS situation, as someone who was analyzing this, you know, I always ask myself, if I announce that there's a new video from ISIS, or if there's a beheading that just happened, by putting that on my Twitter, am I helping ISIS or am I fighting ISIS, or am I being neutral? And so you have to ask yourself very critically, by putting out that tweet or by making that post on Facebook or Instagram, what is this actually going to do? Is this something that ISIS wants me to do? Is this something that Attila Hildmann wants me to do? Or is this something that is actually unhelpful to him? And I think that you can put out stuff, but you have to be critical about it. You have to explain why this is crazy, or why this is wrong, or why people should see this as something that should not be taken seriously. If you just publicize it as a way of saying, look, this is what Attila Hildmann is saying, then you're actually helping him. And so I think you have to contextualize it in a way that actually exposes that person as someone who's peddling conspiracies or lies. So it's really important what you say around it. And of course, you should ask yourself, is it important or not? So when, for example, 2 or 3 days ago, I published this tweet about Attila Hildmann, you know, starting to be openly and explicitly anti-Semitic, I think it was important because up until that point, people thought of him as like a crazy guy, a TV chef who is a narcissist, who wants a lot of attention, who runs around, who drives around in his Ferrari or Porsche and is a bit of an attention seeker, you know, and who also wants to create business. You know, he has a shop, and half of his messages on Telegram are about buying vegan burgers at his shop. So people said, yeah, he's crazy, but he's perhaps not as serious as we make him out to be. And then he suddenly started putting out all this anti-Semitic stuff. And I doubt, you know, I haven't analyzed him personally, but I'm not sure whether he actually believes it, but he puts it out to 60,000 people. He puts it out to 60,000 people. So it has an effect, potential effect on some people. And it is important to tell everyone, and a lot of journalists are on Twitter, to tell them, look, this Attila Hildmann is not the clown that you think he is necessarily. There is a more sinister agenda behind it. And now he's openly embracing anti-Semitism. This is something that needs to be known before you make your next report about him. So that's why I thought it was necessary and important to put that out, even though it involved reproducing some of his Telegram posts.
Also, since you have a lot of knowledge about the Islamic State, and even if it's very quiet about ISIS, I would like to know, is there anything, a trend also regarding conspiracy myths regarding ISIS you can tell us about, or is it more that they're...
Well, I think it's interesting because they have been quite quiet about it. I think they've also been, I mean, there was this big story that was in every Western newspaper about ISIS saying you shouldn't travel to Europe. A travel warning by ISIS, don't go to Europe. But other than that, there hasn't been much. They said maybe the virus is a soldier of Allah because it is affecting Western countries more than it is affecting Muslim countries. But there hasn't been a lot. I think what they are quietly hoping for is that as a result of the virus, governments in the Middle East, in Iraq, in Syria, in other countries where ISIS is active, are distracted, that they are so busy with fighting the virus that they will not pay attention to ISIS anymore, and that this will provide them with an opportunity to come back. And it is true that we've seen, especially in Iraq, an increasing frequency of attacks by ISIS. This is not reported in the Western media, and that's not a conspiracy, by the way. It's just that no one pays attention to it. You know, like every bloody day, you have a Corona special on German TV on all the channels, even though nothing is happening with the virus. And a lot of the world doesn't get covered anymore, except for the coronavirus. So yes, there have been more attacks in Syria and in Iraq. ISIS was beaten in 2018, but it has since not come back in a big way, but it has certainly survived. So it's still active, and it would be a mistake if Western governments concluded that this is completely over and that they don't have any chance anymore. They're still active. I consider the risk of big terrorist attacks like in Paris in 2015, I consider that to be very low right now. But in the region itself, in the Middle East, they're still there. They're doing their best to come back.
We got another question from the audience, also regarding to Attila Hildmann.
Oh yeah.
It is that people like Attila Hildmann actually let actions follow their words. How likely do you think these myths currently circulating will lead to physical violence?
So I think this is almost a central question that anyone who studies radicalization or extremism is asking themselves. At what point, under what circumstances do these ideas translate into violence? And I think one thing that I personally believe is really important is you should always become careful when people start articulating what scholars have described as an existential threat. So if people like Attila Hildmann say that our way of life, our identity, our physical existence is under threat from this government, from this global conspiracy. And that if we don't act now, everything will be lost. Everyone will die. Your children will die. That is a scenario where if you believe it, everything is justified. Everything becomes justified. If there's this external enemy who wants to destroy everything, who wants to kill your children, right? If you believe that this is the threat, then obviously taking up arms and killing people is a legitimate response. And that's why I always become very uncomfortable when people on the far right or on the Islamist side start creating these scenarios. Because in your mind, in the mind of people who believe that, only one conclusion is possible, which is that you now urgently have to take up arms in order to prevent that. And that's the problem with Attila Hildmann right now. If I read his Telegram channel, there are more and more messages just like that, because he realizes I think he realizes in his own mind that he's failing. Fewer and fewer people are coming to his car corsos, fewer and fewer people coming to these demonstrations. In many cities, the demonstrations are not even taking place anymore. Yet he honestly and sincerely believes that this is an existential threat. And so I wonder if some of his core supporters, the really committed supporters, will draw conclusions that go beyond what Attila Hildmann is explicitly encouraging. So whenever you have that sense of existential threat, that everything is going to come down, your children are going to be killed, your identity is going to be destroyed, what option do you have? You have to take up arms. And that is exactly the scenario that Hildmann is currently constructing. And that is a bit worrying, yes.
So we're coming to the end, and I really want to thank you for your time and also for your work you are doing.
Thank you. Thank you for the work you guys are doing.
Thanks a lot. If you want to learn more about extremism and also conspiracy myths, I can suggest that you're following Peter on Twitter. He's tweeting a lot about stuff. And I also want to take the opportunity to inform you guys about the next events of the UJS. On Saturday, we will have the next Havdalah session together with Base Berlin. And in July, we are having our Tikkun Olam in Action Human Rights Academy. You can find everything on our Facebook page. Have a good evening and stay safe and stay healthy. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye.